Although Darwin's finches are considered an icon of evolution, we need to understand that the changes leading to different species of finches, resulting from natural selection and other mechanisms, are not the type of changes required for molecules to man evolution. The terms natural selection and evolution are often used synonymously, but they have distinctly different results. Evolution leads to directional change that over time results in one kind of organism changing into a different kind of organism, like a dinosaur evolving into a bird. However, natural selection leads to non-directional changes that over time result in variation and speciation within a kind, but not leading to a different kind of animal. For example, with Darwin's finches, the environment, including factors such as climate, predators, and food sources, favors birds with certain characteristics such as a long pointed beak or a broad dull beak. Those with the best suited characteristics will survive, and those without are less likely to survive, such that the population becomes dominated by a finch with a particular beak size. Should the environmental conditions change, a finch with a different type of beak may become dominant. What we do not observe is evolution in the sense of a directional change leading from a finch to a non-finch. We do observe variation within the finches that might eventually result in speciation.
So Dr. Purdom, we've seen so many species of finches out here, and I did a lot of research beforehand and tried to learn about the 13 different kinds. I mean, we have 3 different species of small ground finch, or we have a small ground finch, a medium ground finch, and a large ground finch. We have a small, medium, and large tree finch. We have a mangrove finch, a sharp-beaked ground finch. We have a cactus ground finch, a large cactus ground finch. We have woodpecker finch. And I think that's about all of them. Mangrove finch, there we go. There's 13 of them, there's a lot. And every time we see them, I like to think I can identify them. But they're just so similar. And the thing that is just different is their beaks, and that's the only way I can really grasp onto that. Can you explain a little bit more about why we see the variation in the beak size but nothing else?
Well, at least among the ground finches and the cactus finches, they've done a lot of research to kind of determine the genetic factors, at least, that are responsible for this. You know, we see a lot of variation in different characteristics among all the organisms on the islands, but the finches have been studied probably the most. And so at least as far as there's two main factors that are involved. There's a gene called BMP4, which BMP stands for bone morphogenetic protein. So it's kind of a big, so we just call it BMP4. That is responsible for the breadth of it, so to speak, the width, how broad it is. So that's one gene. And they find that in like the large ground finch, which has the big, you know, really wide, broad beak, that it's expressed at very early stages and at very high levels in the embryonic tissue that's responsible for forming the beak. And as you go to the smaller ground finches, you don't see it expressed as early or as much, and so that's why they have their beaks are not as broad. Now, as far as the length goes, it's a completely different gene. It's the calmodulin gene, and that gene is responsible for calcium signaling. So all things associated with bones and that we would think of probably. And what they noticed there is, especially in a cactus finch, because it's specialized for feeding off the cactus, the flowers and such, and so it has a very long, sharp, pointed beak. It's expressed, again, at very high levels, and so you get a much longer beak than you do in some of the ground finches where you have a much shorter beak. And so what's neat about these two genes is that they act independently of one another. And so that's why you can get this huge variety of beak shapes and sizes in all of the finches. And so from the cactus finch that has a lot of the calmodulin, so it's very long, but very low levels of BMP4, so it's very narrow, to the large ground finch, which has very high levels of the BMP4, so it's very broad and wide, but very low levels of calmodulin, so it's very short. So it's amazing that gives the variety. And in any population here, even among the large ground finch, you're going to see some variation. And you want that because that allows the organisms to adapt to their particular environments, whatever the food sources might be, predators might be, so they can adapt very easily, not changing from one kind of animal into another kind of animal, but just allowing adaptation within that particular species or within that particular finch kind.
Okay, so you used the word adaptation. Can you explain kind of the difference of where we come from as creationists, seeing a divine designer behind the fingerprint of God in these finches, and what evolutionists believe? Where do the paths diverge.
Right, and that's the interesting thing here. We have, we were talking about before about the difference between what we're doing, which is observational science, and we can study what causes the changes in the beak shapes. The factors behind it, how the environment's affecting that. We can study that. That's observational science, and we can observe that. The species, we can see changes within the species, but not one kind of species becoming a completely different kind of species, and that's where we differ from the evolutionists, in that we believe in the variation within the species, or variation even within the kind, like the finch kind, but not, for example, a dog becoming a human being, or whatever. We don't see those kinds of changes, and there is no mechanism that can allow one kind of animal to change into a different kind of animal. There's no genetic mechanism, and that's probably the biggest factor, at least for me, the biggest piece of evidence that they're really missing. It doesn't matter how much time you give it, if you don't have a mechanism that allows you to add genetic information to go from one kind of animal to another, it will never happen.
Okay, so I read a lot about mutations and things within species. Is that a way that there could possibly be an introduced amount of genetic information that could cause these variations?
Well, mutations, what we have found, everything that we've observed to this point shows that they don't add genetic information. They either take away or they just allow an alteration of it, but not adding the information that you need to go, for example, from a bacteria to a human being. Because you can't just tweak the DNA or mutate the DNA that's there. You've got to seriously add some major amounts of genetic information, like how to make brains, eyeballs, all of that, in order to get to a human being.
This whole time I've been thinking, I forgot the warbler finch. It's one of my favorite ones. It's the easiest to identify because of its song.
That's right.
We've seen so many finches on all of the islands. Do you have anything interesting about them?
Well, Darwin's finches are probably one of the most studied organisms on all of the Galapagos Islands, and there are a lot of different species of them, and they're a great example of adaptive radiation.
Now, what is adaptive radiation?
Well, adaptive radiation occurs when an organism goes to different areas that are very different environmentally speaking or ecologically speaking, and they basically adapt and become specialized for that particular environment.
Oh.
So you see that. I mean, we know there are a lot of different environments represented here on the islands, not only between islands, but also within the island. And so you get a lot of different species, like the cactus finch versus the ground finch versus the tree finch versus the warbler finch. I mean, you get a lot of, and even with those, within those you have several different species. So there's a lot of those things that are developing here on the island.
Now, you know something about the warbler finches too.
Right, and it's very unique. These are part of Darwin's finches, and so there's two known species right now, Olivacea and Fusca. Those are the two species named. Now, they used to be considered one species because they looked so similar. They were similar morphology and similar behavior.
Now, when you say morphology, I understand that, but not everybody understands what morphology is. What's the morphology?
So what they look like kind of on the outside, beak size, coloration, things that we can physically see. So they used to be considered one species, and then when they started doing genetic studies, they actually divided them into two species, and which is kind of interesting with this particular bird, because they call this an example of cryptic speciation. Okay?
There's another good word.
Hidden, kind of cryptic, meaning hidden speciation, because on the outside they look very similar. They act very similar. But on the inside, when you look at their DNA, they're very different. And it seems to be related to the habitat. So they can be, for example, on, I think it's on Darwin Island, yes, on Darwin Island and Hispaniola, which we know are very far apart. Very far apart. The habitat is very similar there, and so the species is the same that resides there, okay, even though they're very, very far apart. Whereas on Isabela and Amanos, which are two very close islands, they're different species because they have very different habitats there. Yeah. So even though they're very close, there doesn't seem to be they don't seem to be breeding with one another, so to speak. So you've got two different species.
So it's completely unrelated to the distance of the islands. You would base that
right.
on the environment.
On habitat, yes, yes. So it seems to be, and it's very different from the other finches, which in the other finches, they're very similar genetically, but very different in behavior and morphology. So you see something completely different. So there's a lot
Is
of
there a
variety.
word for that too? I like that.
I don't know if they have a word. That's just normal.
should
That's
make one
so
up.
to speak. Yeah, normal speciation. But it's really interesting just to see the variety that I think that God has put in His organisms, the creatures that He created, and how they're even changing. I mean, there's not just one way. There's all these ways that we're still finding out.